Our grandparents used these 17 survival skills daily. How comes they are now illegal? Back in 1934, a man in the Ozarks could walk into the woods with nothing but a knife and a coil of wire and feed his family for a month. No license, no permit, no permission from anyone. Today that same man would face more than a dozen separate violations before sundown. One trick on this list was taught in Boy Scout handbooks for decades. It now carries a federal fine of up to $15,000. Another was printed word for word in the U.S. Army's 1957 Survival Manual. These 17 tricks kept Americans alive through the Great Depression, through world wars, and through winters cold enough to kill livestock where they stood in the fields. But one by one, regulation after regulation, they got buried. Some bans exist for genuinely good reasons. Some exist because somebody in an office decided your grandfather was too free. Either way, you need to know what they were, why they worked, and what the laws now say, because the knowledge still matters, even when the practice is restricted. Welcome to Prepper's Survival Blueprint and Gardening Tricks. Stay until the end, because number 1 on this list ties everything together in a way that will genuinely change how you think about modern outdoor rules. Trick 1. Collecting rainwater off your own roof. Your grandfather did not ask the sky for a receipt. When it rained, he caught it. Every farmstead from the Texas Panhandle to the hollers of West Virginia had rain barrels sitting under the gutters, collecting runoff from tin roofs. Families stored hundreds of gallons through the summer and used it for gardens, livestock, washing, and in lean times, drinking. During the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, rain barrels were the difference between a living garden and dead dirt. Families who had the foresight to collect during spring rains could keep tomatoes and beans growing through July when the wells ran dry and the creeks turned to cracked mud. Children were sent out with buckets during thunderstorms, catching what fell from porch overhangs. Every single drop counted. The barrels were cheap. A used whiskey barrel cost about 50 cents at the general store. Lined with tar, it held water for months without going foul. Your grandmother would drop a piece of charcoal inside to keep it fresh, a trick passed down from her own mother. Simple, brilliant, free. Then states started claiming the rain. Colorado made it illegal to collect rainwater without a permit, citing water rights laws that dated back to gold rush claims. Utah, Nevada, and Oregon followed with their own restrictions. The legal reasoning was that rain belonged to downstream users, that catching it on your own roof deprived rivers and reservoirs of their rightful flow. In 2012, a man in Oregon was sentenced to 30 days in jail for collecting rainwater on his own property. Some states have since loosened the rules, but the idea that the sky itself could be regulated would have made your grandfather laugh until he cried. Trick 2. Snare trapping for small game. Before dawn, your grandfather walked a rabbit run with a pocket full of wire loops. He bent saplings, tied slip knots, and set snares along trails where cottontails moved between brush piles and feeding grounds. By mid-morning he had breakfast. A single roll of brass snare wire cost a dime in the 1940s and could last an entire season. The snare was the poor man's hunting tool. It required no ammunition, no firearm, and almost no noise. Families in Appalachia, the Ozarks, and across the rural South relied on snares the way suburban families rely on grocery stores today. Children learned to set them by the age of 8, reading the ground for tracks and droppings the way city kids read street signs. The technique was precise. The loop had to hang exactly 4 fingers above the trail. Too high and the rabbit ducked under, too low and it triggered without catching. Your grandfather could set a dozen snares in 20 minutes and check them on his way to morning chores. Today, snare trapping is banned or heavily restricted in most states. Animal welfare laws classify snares as indiscriminate and inhumane. In many jurisdictions, setting a snare without a trapping license on the wrong land or during the wrong season carries fines that start at $500 and climb fast. The skill that fed rural America for centuries is now treated like poaching. Trick 3. Building emergency shelters from what the forest offered. If your grandfather got caught in a storm in the national forest, he built a shelter. He did not file paperwork first. He cut pine boughs, leaned them against a fallen log, and packed the gaps with leaves and moss until the wind stopped reaching him. Lean-tos, debris huts, and brush shelters were standard wilderness knowledge taught in every rural schoolhouse through the 1950s. The Civilian Conservation Corps trained thousands of young men who could throw together a survival shelter in under an hour using nothing but a hatchet and what the forest offered. It was considered basic competence, not a specialty skill, just what a capable person knew how to do. But today, constructing any structure on federal land, including national forests and Bureau of Land Management territory, without authorization, violates federal regulations. Even temporary shelters can be cited as unauthorized improvements. Rangers have fined hikers for building debris huts. Survival shelters left standing overnight have been dismantled. The regulations exist to protect ecosystems from damage in high-traffic areas, and there is logic in that, but the practical result is that the most basic survival skill your grandfather ever learned, keeping the rain off his back with sticks and leaves, is now a bureaucratic offense in the woods his taxes helped pay for. Carrying a fixed blade knife as an everyday tool was just a way of life for your grandfather. His belt knife, well, it wasn't a weapon, it was a tool. He used it for all sorts of things: cleaning fish, splitting kindling, notching trap stakes, gutting deer, whittling tent pegs, and even slicing bread. That fixed blade sheath knife rode on his hip the way a phone rides in your pocket today. Back in the 1940s and 50s, a man without a knife in rural America, honestly, was a man who couldn't do his job. Boys got their first knife at about 10 or 12, and keeping it sharp was a real point of pride. Nobody thought twice about it. Hardware stores in the Sears catalog sold millions of fixed blades to working men who needed them every single day. These days, though, carrying a fixed blade knife in public is illegal or restricted in dozens of states and cities. Blade length limits, concealment laws, and outright bans mean that the same knife your grandfather used to survive a week in the woods could actually get you arrested just walking through a parking lot. Some big cities ban any fixed blade with a blade longer than 4 inches. Others restrict concealed fixed blades entirely. The laws, well, they vary wildly by jurisdiction, but the message is pretty consistent. The tool that built the frontier is now treated like a threat. When your grandfather needed clean water out in the backcountry, he wasn't carrying some $40 filter. He read the terrain, found a moving stream, and followed it upstream past any cattle or settlements. Then, he'd dig a shallow hole about 2 feet from the bank. Groundwater would seep in, filtered naturally through sand and gravel, and come up cleaner than the stream itself. If he needed to get water to his campsite, he'd dig a narrow trench or lay a split log channel to redirect the flow. Some families even built small rock dams on seasonal creeks to make pools deep enough to bucket from. It was just practical engineering, nothing fancy. Just reading the land and working with what it gave you. But today, any alteration to a natural waterway, even a temporary dam made of stacked rocks, can violate the Clean Water Act or state water rights statutes. Diverting stream flow without a permit is a federal offense in many western states where water rights are allocated down to the drop. The same rock dam your grandfather built to water his horses could now trigger an EPA investigation. The guy dying of thirst 2 miles from his truck, well, he doesn't care about downstream allocation tables, but the law, it doesn't make exceptions for desperation. Your grandmother, she knew the woods like a pharmacy. She'd pick wild garlic in April, dig sassafras root in May, gather blackberries through July, and harvest black walnuts in October. Foraging wasn't a hobby, it was how families got by when the pantry was running low between harvests. During the Great Depression, wild plants actually kept people alive when the money dried up and the crops failed. Dandelion greens, pokeweed, lamb's quarters, and wood sorrel, those showed up on dinner tables all across the South and Midwest. Kids would carry buckets into the tree line and come back with pounds of berries, mushrooms, and nuts that their mothers turned into pies, preserves, and medicine. Free food from ditches and forest edges, absolutely zero cost, zero permission required. But now, foraging on national park land is prohibited. Collecting plants, mushrooms, nuts and berries in most national parks actually violates the code of federal regulations, and the fines can reach up to $5,000. National forests are a bit more lenient for personal use, but even there, collecting certain species needs permits, and harvesting anything for sale is strictly regulated. The knowledge your grandmother carried in her head, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you, it's now, well, pretty much irrelevant in the very places where it once mattered most. Trick 7. Fishing without a license because you were hungry. Your grandfather fished because he was hungry, not because it was a weekend activity. He walked to the nearest creek with a cane pole, a hook, and a worm dug from the garden. There was no license in his wallet. There did not need to be. Through the first half of the 20th century, millions of rural Americans fished daily for food with no regulation whatsoever. Farm ponds, creeks, and rivers were open to anyone with a line. Catfish, bluegill, crappie, and bass kept families fed through summers when the garden was not yet producing and the pantry was running low. A skilled fisherman could pull enough protein for a family of 6 in a single afternoon, with the simplest gear imaginable. By the 1950s, states began requiring fishing licenses to fund conservation programs. The logic was sound. Fish populations genuinely needed management. But the practical effect was to transform a basic survival skill, feeding yourself from the nearest water, into a regulated privilege. Today, fishing without a valid license carries fines from $50 to well over $500, depending on the state. For a man in rural Oklahoma in 1935, being told he needed government permission to catch his dinner would have sounded like a very bad joke. Here is where things take a serious turn. Your grandfather was not just surviving the wilderness, he was actively managing it. The next set of tricks involves methods so effective that entire industries were built around banning them, not because they did not work, but because they worked too well. Trick 8. Setting deadfall traps. The figure 4 deadfall was the oldest trap in American wilderness survival. 3 sticks, notched precisely, balanced a heavy flat rock over a trigger platform baited with whatever the target animal wanted most. Squirrels, raccoons, rabbits, even larger game walked under the stone, touched the trigger, and dinner was secured. Your grandfather carved these from green wood with his belt knife in under 10 minutes. The design was so effective it appeared in Native American archaeological sites dating back thousands of years and in every military survival manual published before 1970. It required no metal, no moving parts, and no ammunition. Just gravity, patience, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Today, deadfall traps are illegal in virtually every state. Wildlife agencies classify them as non-selective devices capable of injuring non-target species, including protected animals. Setting one on public land constitutes illegal trapping and can carry penalties identical to poaching charges. The trap that kept your ancestors alive since before recorded history is now a wildlife violation that can cost you hundreds of dollars and your hunting privileges. Trick 9. Smoking meat for long-term preservation. When your grandfather killed a deer in November, he did not eat it all in a week. He smoked it. He built a small smokehouse from scrap lumber or dug a pit, hung strips of venison over green hickory coals, and let low heat and smoke preserve the meat for months without refrigeration. Smoked venison, rabbit, and fish kept families fed through winters when fresh food was completely impossible. The technique was ancient, older than civilization itself, and every rural American family knew how to do it. Some families had smokehouses standing for 3 generations, the wood so saturated with smoke and creosote it would never rot. The smell of hickory smoke drifting from a backyard smokehouse was as common as birdsong in October. Today, selling or distributing smoked meat without USDA inspection is a federal offense. Even sharing large quantities with neighbors can cross legal lines in some jurisdictions. Home processing of wild game for anything beyond strictly personal consumption enters a legal gray area that most prosecutors interpret unfavorably. The smokehouse that fed entire communities for generations is now a liability. Trick 10. Cutting timber for shelter and heat. Your grandfather did not buy firewood wrapped in plastic from a gas station. He cut it. When he needed a cabin, he felled trees. When he needed warmth through a hard winter, he split logs. Access to timber was so fundamental to American survival that early homestead laws specifically required settlers to improve the land, which meant cutting trees and building structures. That was the expectation. That was the proof you were serious about staying. Families spent weeks each autumn felling, bucking, and splitting enough wood to last the winter. The sound of an axe ringing through cold air was the soundtrack of November in every mountain community from the Adirondacks to the Cascades. Boys learned to fall a tree safely and split a cord of wood before they were old enough to drive. Today, cutting any tree on federal or state land without a permit is illegal. Even collecting dead and fallen wood requires authorization in most national forests, with permits that limit you to specific quantities and specific locations. The man who built his home from the forest around him would now need a stack of paperwork taller than the cabin itself. If you do need firewood legally, look for designated firewood collection zones or obtain the proper permit from your local land manager. The skills are still worth learning. Just practice them where the law allows. Trick 11. Hunting out of season when the family was hungry. There was no season when your grandfather was hungry. If the family needed meat in March and a deer walked through the back 40, that deer became dinner. Subsistence hunting followed the calendar of need, not the calendar printed by the Game Commission. Through the Depression, families across rural America hunted year-round because starvation does not observe bag limits. Oral histories from Appalachian communities describe families who survived entire winters on deer, squirrel, and wild turkey taken whenever the opportunity arose, regardless of what month the calendar said. Fathers taught sons to move quietly, shoot cleanly, and waste nothing. The meat was eaten, the hide was tanned, the bones were boiled for broth. Nothing was left behind. Today, hunting outside of designated seasons is poaching. Fines start in the hundreds and can reach tens of thousands of dollars, plus loss of hunting privileges, confiscation of firearms, and even jail time. Wildlife management has real value. Regulated seasons rebuilt populations that were genuinely threatened with collapse. But the fundamental survival instinct of feeding your family when food presents itself is now a criminal act. That is a tension worth sitting with. Trick 12. Picking up eagle and hawk feathers. So, your grandfather found a red-tailed hawk feather on a fence post and just tucked it into his hat band. He wasn't thinking about federal law, he just thought it looked nice. For centuries, Americans collected feathers from birds of prey, songbirds, and waterfowl for decoration, for fletching arrows, for tying fishing flies, and, well, for dozens of other practical uses. Feathers were everywhere, free for the picking. But the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 changed everything. That law made it illegal to possess feathers from any of more than 1,000 protected species. That includes eagles, hawks, owls, songbirds, herons, and, honestly, most waterfowl. Picking up a single feather from the ground, even one shed naturally, even one just lying in a parking lot, can technically result in a fine of up to $15,000 and 6 months in prison. The law was written to stop the commercial feather trade that was driving multiple species toward extinction, and it really did succeed at that mission. But the blanket prohibition means that the hawk feather your grandfather wore in his hat, without a second thought, is now a federal offense sitting in your junk drawer if you picked one up last week without knowing the rules. Trick 13. Setting controlled burns to manage the land. Every autumn, your grandfather would deliberately set fire to his fields. He burned brush, cleared deadfall, and scorched the understory to prevent the catastrophic wildfires that could consume entire mountainsides. Native Americans had been using controlled burns for thousands of years before European settlement, and the practice kept going through rural America well into the 1960s. These fires ran low and cool, burning off accumulated fuel while leaving mature trees standing and healthy. The result was healthier forests, better grazing land, and honestly, dramatically reduced wildfire risk. Communities that managed their land with fire had fewer catastrophic fires. That was not a coincidence. It was cause and effect. By the 1970s, though, controlled burning without permits became illegal across most of the country. Environmental regulations, air quality standards, and liability concerns turned a practice that had maintained forests for millennia into a regulatory minefield. These days, setting a controlled burn without authorization is classified as arson in most jurisdictions. Meanwhile, decades of fire suppression have loaded American forests with so much accumulated fuel that when wildfires do start, they burn with an intensity that makes your grandfather's little autumn clearing fire look like a birthday candle. Trick 14. Digging a Dakota fire hole for invisible cooking. The Dakota fire hole was your grandfather's secret weapon for cooking in wind, rain, or, hostile territory. He'd dig 2 holes about a foot apart, connect them with a tunnel at the bottom, and build his fire in one hole, while the other served as an air intake. The design created a natural draft that burned hotter, used up less wood, and produced almost no visible smoke. The U.S. Army actually taught this method extensively during World War II and the Korean War. Scout manuals included detailed diagrams all the way through the 1960s. It was considered the most efficient field cooking method ever devised for a man with nothing but a stick to dig with. Soldiers, scouts, and wilderness travelers all learned it as a fundamental skill. These days, though, digging any fire pit on public land without authorization violates land management regulations in most jurisdictions. The holes disturb soil and root systems, and the fire itself requires a permit in fire-prone regions. Even in wilderness areas where campfires are otherwise allowed, excavating a pit can get you a citation for resource damage. Your grandfather's smokeless, windproof cooking fire is now a violation of the leave no trace principles that pretty much govern modern outdoor recreation. Trick 15. Making lye soap from ash and animal fat. Your grandmother made soap from just 2 ingredients, rendered animal fat and lye water leached from hardwood ash. She filled a wooden hopper with white oak or hickory ash, poured water through it, and collected the brown alkaline liquid that dripped from the bottom. Mixed with melted tallow in an iron kettle over an open fire, that liquid saponified into bars strong enough to strip grease from cast iron and gentle enough to wash a baby. Families made soap once or twice a year, producing enough to last until the next batch. The skill survived in rural communities through the 1950s, practiced by women who had never bought a bar of commercial soap in their lives. Because, honestly, there was no reason to. What the farm produced and what the forest gave you was enough. Today, the open fire production methods your grandmother used, burning hardwood, rendering fat over open flame, disposing of spent ash, can each trigger separate municipal health code and air quality violations depending on where you live. The soap that built domestic life in America for 3 centuries now requires navigating a regulatory maze to produce the way it was always made. Trick 16. Harvesting pine pitch as a waterproofing agent. Your grandfather harvested pine pitch straight from wounded trees. He heated it over a fire and mixed it with charcoal dust and animal fat to create a waterproof adhesive that sealed canoe seams, repaired boots, and waterproofed shelters. This compound has been used by humans for at least 200,000 years. It was the original superglue, the original silicone sealant, and the original waterproofing spray. All in one material that cost absolutely nothing. He would score a living pine, collect the sap in a tin can, and cook it down until it thickened into a workable paste. The technique required no tools that had not existed for thousands of years, and produced a product that modern chemistry still struggles to fully replicate for sheer field practicality. Today, harvesting sap or pitch from trees on public land is prohibited in most national forests and all national parks. Damaging a living tree, even by scoring the bark to collect resin, constitutes vandalism of natural resources. A technique that predates every human civilization currently on Earth is now a ticketable offense on federal land. Trick 17. Building a rock weir to funnel and catch fish. Your grandfather stacked rocks across a shallow stream to funnel fish into a narrow channel where they could be caught by hand or with a simple basket trap. Fish weirs were used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and were adopted by European settlers as one of the most efficient methods of catching large quantities of fish with zero manufactured equipment. The structures worked passively, catching fish during migration runs without any human even present. A well-built weir could feed a family for an entire spawning season on nothing more than some stacked stones and patience. No hooks, no line, no boat, just engineering and a deep knowledge of how fish moved through water. Today, constructing any obstruction in a navigable waterway is a federal offense under the Rivers and Harbors Act. Even in non-navigable streams, rock weirs can violate state fish and game regulations. The Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act protections for migrating fish. The oldest fishing technology in North America is now one of the most heavily regulated acts you can perform near a stream. What this really means for you. Your grandfather did not break laws. The laws had not been written yet. He lived in a world where competence was assumed, self-reliance was expected, and freedom meant the freedom to keep yourself alive using the land around you. He carried a knife, caught his dinner, built his shelter, and lit his fire because that is what a capable person did. No permit required, no permission sought. Some of the regulations that replace these practices are genuinely necessary. Some protect resources that legitimately need protecting. Fish populations were collapsing, species were being wiped out by commercial exploitation. Wildfire behavior has changed. Ecosystems are under real pressure. That part is true, and it matters. But there is something else equally true. The next time you are standing in a national forest surrounded by deadfall you cannot collect, beside a stream you cannot dam, holding a feather you cannot keep. Remember this chapter, Taituwesan Vertanves. Your grandfather would have been home by now with dinner on the fire and a warm shelter at his back. And he would not have needed to ask a single person for permission to take care of his own family. The knowledge still matters. Even when the laws have changed, knowing how these things work makes you more prepared, more resourceful, and less dependent on systems that can fail without warning. Learn to tie a snare, even if you never set one. Study the plants your grandmother knew by name. Understand how a Dakota fire hole works before you ever need it in a crisis. Learn which trees give pitch and what it can seal. Read the terrain for water, the way your grandfather did. These are not just history lessons. They are contingency plans, because regulations can be adjusted. Emergency situations do not always care about regulations, and the gap between knowing and not knowing can matter more than any permit ever could. Drop a comment below telling us which trick surprised you most, and if your own grandparents taught you something that did not make this list, share it, because that knowledge deserves to survive too. Hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss a new episode from Prepper Survival Blueprint and Gardening Tricks. See you in the next one.